Hi, I'm Russ Jennings, host of LoveInADangerousTime.net, a conversation about communities of faith and how we change the world. Seminary Dropout is supported by listeners like you and me. You should support the show like I did. It's easy. Just visit supportseminarydropout.com.
You're listening to Seminary Dropout, episode 57, and I'm your host, Shane Blackshear. This week on the show, I'll talk with author J.R. Briggs about his new book, Fail, and also about how he's a little suspicious about the way I spend my birthday.
And is today your birthday?
Today is my birthday.
Well, happy birthday to you. I thought, does he really want to share part of his birthday with me?
There's no one I'd rather share it with, J.R. All this and more on this week's episode of Seminary Dropout. Let's go. J.R. Briggs serves as a cultural cultivator for the Renew community, a Jesus community for skeptics and dreamers in Lansdale, Pennsylvania. He also serves as the Director of Leadership and Congregational Formation with the Ecclesia Network. He is the creator and the curator of the Epic Fail Pastors Conference. J.R. Briggs, thanks so much for joining me on Seminary Dropout today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're here to talk about your new book, Fail. This all started from, if we trace it back to something, I guess it would be a blog post that you posted maybe a few years back about your kind of impressions about pastors' conferences. What's wrong with pastors' conferences?
Well, I found that while there's lots of good, and we should be learning a great deal from pastors who do it well, what I found is that there were only a certain type of pastor that was being invited to these events, and they were always successful, large, charismatic churches. And I'm by charismatic leader, I don't mean necessarily theologically as much as their leadership style. And I found myself saying, and I was in a hard season myself as a pastor, saying, first of all, I don't relate to them because I'm not opening up my 12th satellite campus, and I'm not worrying about adding my 19th service for the weekend. But of saying not only that, but I walk away finding myself comparing myself to them, and it either isn't relevant or I just feel worse. And I looked around, and it wasn't just about how I would feel about myself, but I asked, where are those pastors who are fruitful and faithful in their ministry, but they pastor small churches, or there's obscurity and no one knows them. They've never written a book, but they've got great wisdom to share. Where are those types of people? And can I learn from those pastors? And so I just went home saying, man, I'd love to see a conference instead of putting all these successful people up there. What if we had an event where we actually flipped it, and instead of putting your best foot forward, you put your worst foot forward and said, not just a moan and groan session, but where is God in the midst of the uncertainty or the failure or the lack of quote unquote fame? And what if it culminated after 2 or 3 days into communion at the end, and people walked away saying, God was here? What if we did that? And it was just a total parody, satirical blog post that blew up. And we said, wow, I think we've touched a nerve here. What's going on?
And you had pastors calling you like almost within the hour of you posting that. You had really touched a nerve.
Yeah, it was... my phone was blowing up. There were comments. I've never written anything that's gotten more hits. And people kept saying, so when is it? And I said, no. This was just a total parody. This was not something. This was totally theoretical. And then they said, well, why? Why wouldn't you do something like this? And I said, I don't know. I have the spiritual ungift of event planning. I can't possibly pull this off myself. But a few friends said, we believe in this enough. We think this is too important. We're good at administrative details and event planning. Let's do it. And so we pulled the trigger on it and decided to host this event. And we thought it might be, a few dozen people coming from driving distance, an hour or two away, more regional event. And we found there were pastors from 17 different states. And my favorite, though, is a gentleman that flew over from Australia, had never been to America, came for this event and turned back and flew right home after the event. And I sought him out and I said, tell me, why did you fly all the way over here to meet for this kind of backwards event, very countercultural, counterintuitive? event for a few days and then fly back home. And he said, because I can't find any safe place to talk about the dangerous message of failure in my town, in my province, in my country. And the only place I could find it was halfway across the world. And I said, whoa, we're on to something here.
The thing about pastors' conferences is, it reminds me of this. There's this great Seth Godin quote that I remember, and he said that young married women in New York City think that most women, when they get married, keep their maiden name, but they don't. He said, people who are really into wine think that most people are too. People that work out, a few times a week think that most people do as well. The thing about pastors' conferences are when you are doing nothing but hearing stories from these pastors, you think that story's happening to everybody but myself. And I must be the link that's doing something wrong like that. I'm guessing that's kind of a story that you probably came across a lot in those pastors' conferences.
Absolutely. And these events, if anything, it's not moan and groan sessions. We aren't highlighting or glorifying failure as some sort of heroic feat, but to say, we just don't want people to walk away and say, I'm the only one, I'm the weird one. People walk away and say, me too. And there's a connection there with other pastors, but more importantly with the Lord. And that's what we want to make sure that though the dominating voice are the successful ones, in quotation marks, but to say the majority of churches are actually small churches. And you'd never think that by the conferences or podcasts or blogs or whatever it may be. And those are all, again, very beneficial things I engage and participate in. But there are also, we have to be careful it doesn't distort the fact that that's not the percentage. The vast percentage of churches are under 200. And the average church in America, some studies say 60, some say 65. But the average church in America is between 60 and 65 people. We have to be very careful about how we're coming to define a successful, quote unquote, pastor.
I have found, and I think this has got to be especially true for pastors, that people are just begging to be honest about what's going on inside of them and their true feelings and their true experiences. But often they need one other person to be honest first, and then a floodgate opens up after that. Has that been the case at these pastor conferences? And then just in general, when you are having these conversations?
Yeah, very much so. Our team that puts these events together, they always say, JR, you need to go first, and you always need to tell your story right away. Because I said, maybe someone else should do it, at this next event. And they always say, no, you have to do it and tell your story, because when you tell it with conviction and courage and emotion, and oftentimes I break up myself emotionally telling it, they said it does something and people begin to open up in ways. And you're right, it's the go first principle. You just need somebody to model that well, and others go, you know what, me too. And I feel the same thing. And my story is similar. And you just need that person that's willing to go first and have others follow along. And the interesting thing is that even though it's a conference on failure and ministry, it's really a grace conference, cleverly disguised as a ministry failure conference. But you can't call it a grace conference because pastors say, I teach on grace, I parse the Greek word of grace. I know grace.
We've done that.
But and so therefore I get it. But just because we preach on it effectively from the pulpit on Sunday does not mean it's gotten through our bloodstreams Monday through Saturday. And so we kind of have to call it a failure conference to have people realize it's a grace conference, but you got to come through the back door. And so some of it addresses the overarching systemic issues briefly, but it's mostly dealing with the inward heart stuff. And am I saturated in gospel stuff? Or am I using the metrics of the world to use that to take on my identity and let what I do define me rather than who I am, and more importantly, to whom I belong?
Well, you mentioned your story, and you pretty much start out the book telling your story. I have to admit, JR, when I was reading, your story begins with being begged to come to a mega church. And I was like, all right, you don't know what failure is, buddy. I know all of our stories start out with being begged to come to a mega church. but it wasn't a humble brag, because things got very real very quickly. Can you just tell the audience a little bit about that story for you?
Yeah, it was 2 years of what my wife and I call the dark years, and it sent us spiraling into a place that was very dark, of not being able to trust people. The reason that we came, a particular pastor who was going to build into us and mentor us, come to find out there were a lot of things that were untrue, and the reason that we were excited to come was not the truthful reason or the reality that we came to. After a handful of months, he was, after 20 plus years of ministry, asked to leave. The vision of the church changed. There was just a lot crumbling around us. And in the midst of all of that, my wife and I finding out about our infertility, of which I was the problem in infertility. And so all those lies and shame culturally that the evil one loved to use and whisper in my ear, it just came crashing down, and it was a very difficult season of a lot of weight loss, and getting to the point, one breaking point of saying, I need help, and I need to seek out some professional help because I'm in a dark place, and if I don't get help, this is not going to end well. And it was, as Ian Morgan Cron says, all ministry begins at the ragged edges of our pain, and in many ways that ragged edge of my pain was the very thing that God used to bring some breakthrough and growth in my own life, and also hopefully steward my pain well in the direction of redemptive hope, not in a moan and groan posture. And that's what we want to do. Is I really want to make sure we're stewarding this story. And if that means we wait it out for the next 6 months and it goes away, that's fine. But if this is something larger, we want to just steward that well. And I hope I speak out of my wounds, out of my scars and not out of my wounds. When you speak out of your wounds, it scares people and it can be less than helpful. But if you speak out of your scars, there's a redemptive hope that you bring with it to show other people, yeah, this scar hurts right here, but I've come out on the other side by God's grace for his glory, not for my own. And that isn't a nice Christian cliche. That's a reality that I now understand because of this nasty scar that I have that's turned into a way of stewarding hope to other people.
You were able to break down categories of different types of failure. You broke it down into one, the mighty fall, which is basically some kind of moral failure or something like that. We hear a lot about that. A tragic event, so maybe a spouse comes down with a terminal illness or something like that, tragic car accident, those kind of things. The slow leak, which I have to say I identified with most, just that there's not one big thing, it's just over time. And I think you used a great quote from a pastor that said something like, over the past couple of years, I was able to grow my church from 150 to 25 people or something like that.
Yeah.
And then the burnt out statistic, just the schedule is unsustainable, the lifestyle is unsustainable, and then the ramifications for that. So I guess pretty much everybody that you talk to could fit into one of those 4 categories, right?
Yeah, we certainly, aren't a big fan of labeling people, but as we try to look at it, we said, all these stories, while they're unique and different, seem to fall in one of these categories here, which then allowed us to walk alongside of pastors through in a different expression, right? If there's a moral failure, that's going to be different than we tried to plant a church, and after 2 years we ran out of money, no one showed up, we had to shut the doors. So you walk alongside of people very differently depending on the category or the type of failure that they're in, and trying to listen well, but even the types of questions you ask to know how you can walk alongside of pastors depends on what type, whether it's a mighty fall or a tragic event or what have you.
You gave some just nothing short of shocking statistics. And if I could, I want to just read some of those. 1,500 pastors leave the ministry for good each month due to burnout or contention in their churches. 50% of pastors' marriages end in divorce. Half of all pastors' marriages end in divorce. That blew my mind. 40% of pastors seriously consider leaving the pastorate in the past 3 months. Pastors who work fewer than 50 hours a week are 35% more likely to be terminated. Fewer than 50 hours a week. 80% of pastors report ministry adversely affecting their families, or it has adversely affected their family. Almost 40% of pastors polled said that they have had extramarital affairs since the beginning of their ministry. 40%. 70% of pastors say they do not have a single close friend. I think, JR, you and I and most of us know a lot of people in ministry who, at the very least, at some point got into ministry for extremely pure reasons, extremely good-hearted reasons. We certainly don't do it to become wealthy, and there's little motivation outside of good motivation to get into that work. And yet, as we read here, there's a lot of moral failure, and there's a lot of burnout, like we talked about. So it leads me to believe there's got to be something about the work that wears people down, that being a pastor is hazardous to your health, basically. Is that something that you found?
Yeah, I mean, I love the story that Eugene Peterson tells. He's giving blood one day. He's on the table during a blood drive, and a woman comes in to ask him a bunch of questions. And, have you been sick in the last few months? Or when's the last time you gave blood? And then looking at her chart, she said, "Are you engaged in hazardous work?" And he said, "Yes." And she looked up and said, "What work do you engage in?" And he said, "I'm a pastor." And she kind of gave a quick chuckle and rolled her eyes and went back to her survey. But Eugene said, "No, seriously, I'm involved in some hazardous work here." And, the calling of the pastor is important, but it is devastating. And I think of all the stats that you read, there's one, and when I've been asked, what's the one that devastates you the most? It's that for every 20 pastors that start in ministry, only one actually ends well in ministry. And it's very startling. And so some of that is on the, needs to be owned by pastors, and some temptations that we are seduced by, that we should not be seduced by, in terms of workaholism, in terms of consumerism, in terms of the celebrity pastor pull, at the current that seems to be so strong. But some of it I think we need to think through in terms of how we're preparing and equipping our pastors in seminary. I think it even means our elders and leaders need to actually make sure we're really clear on what does quote-unquote success look like in our particular church. Everyone has a metric of success, whether they know it or not. And how you define success will define you, which conversely, how you define failure will define you too. And so having these conversations to look at the system and say, what is the metric of success? And I like the word health better than success. But what is our metric of which we're measuring if we're actually doing what we're supposed to be doing in our original mission? And unfortunately, we've seen it time and time again. Almost all of the metrics of local churches that we've noticed around the country, with alarmingly few exceptions, are the 3 B's: buildings, bodies, and budgets. Because we say if those 3 things are up, we're on a building project, our attendance is up, and our budget is up 12% from last year at this time. If we use those only as the metrics, it really can get dangerous. And or some people say attendance, buildings, and cash, the ABCs. And if we stick to the ABCs, James Bryan Smith says we never get to the D, which is discipleship. And we never get to the F's of fruitfulness and faithfulness and feeling very fulfilled in ministry too, by just knowing we're walking obediently in the Spirit. But those are harder to quantify. And so we gravitate towards those things that we can quantify very easily. And so we just have to have a different metric in how we think about health and failure and success. Because if not, we will be lured in to think like the business model, which we have for quite some time. And we just need to have the courage to rethink that and have difficult conversations and ask, are these metrics the same metrics that Jesus had in mind? And if not, are we okay with them being different than how the founder of Christianity saw what a metric of health would look like?
It occurred to me when you were talking about those 3 metrics that we mostly use with buildings, bodies, and cash, money. It seems to me if the metrics we use for success could also be applied for any business, then there's probably something wrong with that, something unspiritual about that. You told a great story about how you had feelings of inadequacy because you had not been ordained. And it's kind of one of those things, you get to a point where people kind of assume that that's already happened. I have a very similar story. I'm not ordained. Planted a church with some friends when I was 23, I think. So also very young, had plenty of insecurities, was going to seminary at the time. So I wasn't done, didn't even finish seminary, and a lot of feelings of inadequacy. The name of this show is a double entendre. It's a metaphor for the show, but I am literally a seminary dropout. So I hopefully kind of try to subvert the shame from that kind of thing. But it's true. I feel like a lot of this comes from us putting pastors in a place where they should not be. And we, as pastors, I feel like we do that. We want the authority and that kind of thing of being on the pedestal, but we don't want the responsibility and the weight that comes on it. And it feels like we have turned the pastorate into something that the Bible and that Jesus never intended for it to be. And people hold us to those standards as well. And so it seems like perhaps that's where a lot of that pressure comes on that makes us turn to things like extramarital affairs and that kind of stuff. Have you seen that when you're out there talking to people?
Yeah, one of the greatest things we see from pastors in terms of what keeps them from being honest is they're afraid. It's mostly based in fear. If I'm really honest, I will lose my job. And so we teach on grace, but don't feel like we could ever receive grace from the people we're leading and shepherding in the direction of grace. This is very counterintuitive. And so they just sort of say, I so long to have a space where I can take the masks off and I can talk about this openly. And risk aversion is what happens when failure is not processed appropriately or in a healthy manner. Mm. And so pastors have a whole set of ornate masks that we reach for that, in fact, they're so good that maybe even we're fooling our spouses and fooling the people that are sitting in the front row of our churches. And so we just have to be willing, if I pick up the mask, I'm putting down the cross. And we have to realize that, do we want to talk about grace? Do we want to preach on it? Or do we want to actually let it get and run wild in our bloodstream? And in fact, we just, even the Christian story, the gospel story is predicated. The entrance exam to the Christian life is admitting you're a failure. And it's called confession and repentance. And so here we are, rooted in this story. We enter the kingdom of heaven and life with Christ when we admit we've screwed up, but I can't dare share with you that I've screwed up, or you might lop my head off. There's just something messed up there. And I really think whether you're talking about grace or whether you actually embody grace, when a leader in a church fails, how a church responds to that failure is the litmus test of grace. Mm. Whether it's the pastor or a key leader, an elder or a small group leader, whatever it may be, do we just talk about grace, or is this a place that if you cut us open, we would bleed grace? Mm. And that's an important thing for us to keep in mind because, are we going to allow either control, which is a temptation for pastors? I'm going to control everything, including PR. I'm going to control. Reputation control is a big temptation for pastors on one end. On the other end is resignation. To say, I don't mean resign as in I'm giving my 2 weeks, but as in I'm going to coast. Yeah. And my soul is on life support, but nobody knows it. And I'm just going to mail it in because I don't know what else to do. I'm feeling stuck. And instead of control on one side and resignation on the other, there's this middle ground of yielding or surrendering, saying, Jesus, I need you to pastor me as I'm trying to pastor other people so that I'm no longer driven by fear, but I'm motivated by love, where I have, as Ken Davis says, nothing to hide, nothing to lose, and nothing to prove. Because that's freedom. I think that's a great definition of freedom. And unfortunately, too many pastors have too many things to hide. They have too many things to lose, and they have too many things to prove. And if we can model for our congregations in courageous and wise ways, that's important that it's wise as well. But we have nothing to hide and nothing to lose and nothing to prove because of the work of Jesus. That's better than 1,000 sermons from up front if we're living that out in our life.
You talk a lot about how shame factors in to failure for pastors. What's the role of shame in this process?
Yeah. When I went through this season several years ago, I knew I was in a place that needed help. I went to a counselor, and after a few sessions, I said, my biggest fear in life, I figured it out. It's failure. And he said, all right, well, let's talk about it. And we talked about it. I came in a few sessions later, and I said, no, I was wrong. My biggest fear in life is not failure. It's rejection that happens after I've failed. He said, okay, let's talk about it. And a few sessions later, I walked in and I said, I was wrong again. My biggest fear in life is shame that happens after I've been rejected, when I failed. And he said, now you're onto something. Let's really get down and start talking. And what I did, I just began to explore how shame was so controlling in my life. And if I don't deal with my shame well as a human, but even as a pastor, I will then turn and be a skilled shame manipulator on my people. And I will then begin to exert that damage or control or oppression or legalism on them without allowing them opportunity to enter into the freedom that Jesus gives us. And so I said, I got to deal with this idea of shame inside of me and break that cycle in my mind that though I'm rejected and I feel disgraced and there's shame there, that I have to allow the renewing of my mind for Jesus to work in that, to whisper a different narrative, a truthful narrative that overrides the volume of the evil one. It says, you may be rejected by others, but the God of the universe, your Father in heaven, loves you and accepts you. And even though you feel shame maybe from other people, realize you are an honored child of the King. And I realized if I didn't get that down, I would be stuck in a prison of shame as a human that would make me miserable, as a husband, as a father, and as a pastor. And unfortunately, too many pastors, we haven't had spaces or courage to drill down deep, to go there to those dark places of shame and say, Jesus, you got to meet me here in the mud, because if not, I'm not going to be representing you in very healthy ways. So it's a lot of inner soul work that can be scary, but it's only when we're vulnerable that we grow. And so there has to be gospel growth in us for us to be able to actually embrace our calling and faithfully live that out, to invite other people out of the shame and out of the shadows, to throw their masks away, to really be accepted and embraced, to receive grace too.
Well, you spend a good third of the book talking about, okay, we know the problem. How do we deal with this? How do we move forward in a better way? And one of my favorite things that you said was that it's important for pastors to have a mentor. I think a lot of us just fall in this trap and feeling like we get into a certain place spiritually or professionally where we feel like we don't need that anymore. But that's really not the case. How did you come to that conclusion that was something that people needed?
Yeah, the most common thing that we would hear in these events is, I'm lonely. No one else can relate to me. I'm the only one. And which, by the way, is one of Satan's most damaging lies or half-truths that he tells us. And so we just said, okay, one of Satan's greatest tools is isolation. One of God's greatest gifts is community, this idea of the church. And I just heard the other day, Dallas Willard, when someone said, why should someone go to church? And he said, because we need to find people to love and to be loved by. And I thought that's a beautiful expression. I hope that includes pastors too. And it does. But we need to love and be loved too in communities. And that loneliness, that's where isolation happens. That's where lies and deception happen. Loneliness creeps in, and we begin to feel like I got to fight this on my own. And then we start the self-deception pattern of masking, covering, self-medicating, coping, and then hoping we won't get caught in those things that we're doing in the darkness. And it's just it's a vicious pattern. And to be called into the light is scary, but we need that. And unfortunately, there are too few people that say, I need someone to hold my hand to do this. I think I have the courage, but my knees are wobbling. I got to have somebody who's going to hold my hand through this process to say, hey, I need some help here. And I needed an AA group for pastors, and I couldn't find it. And in many ways, all Epic Fail events is an AA group for pastors.
One of the other things that you recommend for pastors is to go to a small group that they don't lead. It seems like there needs to be a space for pastors, hopefully within their own church, where they don't have to be on, so to speak. I mean, hopefully nothing they do is a performance, but to just be able to step out of that role for a little bit and be able to have some nourishment themselves.
Absolutely. I sat with a pastor friend of mine who's here in town about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, and he was in a very dry place. And I said, what do you need? And he said, I need people who don't need me. And I thought there are a lot of pastors that could say, I need people who don't need me right now, where we can I think the danger falls on us when we believe that when we put ourselves as pastor first before being a person, and we can't ever forget that we're a person first before we're a pastor. And when those roles get mixed up, a lot of damage can happen. And so when you have a space where you can let your hair down, and when you can have an off day, you don't have to apologize or fake through it. You just say, guys, today as a person, I'm having a difficult day.
Yeah.
And I just need a space where I can be loved and accepted as a human in that process of having an off day. I hope pastors can have an off day, but unfortunately, I think a lot of pastors don't feel like they can have an off day, which can be really dangerous too.
When you're saying that, you're reminding me of, and I think it may have been Jonathan Edwards, or one of those pastors who, if it wasn't him, it was someone like him. But his during one of their gatherings, there was a fire in the building and some people died at the church, and he struggled with depression for the rest of his life after that. And I remember reading that it was kind of this kind of book that had compiled some bios of people like him, and it said that he would from time to time get up on Sunday mornings and say, "Hey, I'm feeling pretty down today," and just be very transparent about his depression and struggle with that. I thought, no way would any pastor say that or be allowed to say that from the pulpit on a Sunday morning. I mean, it's just unheard of. And it's really sad that we don't give our pastors that permission to be real with us. By far, the most popular blog post I ever written was one about 5 ways to be unsatisfied with the church. It really wasn't controversial or anything. And for the most part, it was well received. But the biggest pushback I got was from people who were saying, this is just another person saying what I need to do, and you don't know how my pastor has hurt me and how awful they are and that kind of thing. And even some of our hurts as pastors come from other pastors. So there's a lot of legitimacy there. I don't want to take that away, but at the same time, I think we're really hard as pastors, and being someone who is not a pastor anymore, who's been on the other side of it, I really want to strive to love my pastor well. And so for those who are listening, who are not pastors, but also want to love their pastor well, how can they do that?
Yeah, great question. I'm really glad you asked it, and I wish more people would ask this question. I was just leading a pastoral health conference at a seminary here in the Philadelphia area on Saturday, and someone asked that. We had a great discussion during that panel discussion on this. The first thing I would say is don't just pray for your pastor, commit to prayer on behalf of your pastor. What I mean, the difference on that is not, I'll pray for your pastor, kind of this passive, when I think of it, I might do it, I might not, but I'm going to purposefully commit over a longer period of time to intercede on behalf of you and your family. When I know people are doing that and they regularly tell me that, I say there's no greater gift you can give to me and my family right now. So that's the first one. And the second one is, whether you're in an official formal leadership role at the church or not, to healthily pressure your pastor into practicing Sabbath. Pastors need breaks, just like we all do. And they need to be reminded this is not their church, it's Jesus' church. And taking a day off, Jesus is in control, and we need those spaces to rest and recoup and pray and play. I would also, on a very practical level, encourage churches to put aside $1,000 in the budget each year to allow their pastor to go to counseling one time a month. And the only question you need to ask is, did you spend the money? Nothing else. They don't need to report back what they talked about. Just, did you go see a counselor, and did you spend the money? And then also hold them to it to make sure they're taking vacation. I just read yesterday about a church. They require their staff they don't roll over their vacation anymore. They actually require that they use all their vacation days every year. And I thought that's a simple change, but it's a big one. It's a statement of what we value, and it's that pastors are rested. Even requiring that they take a day away once a month to rest, reflect, be in silence and solitude, away from their phone, away from their computer, to just be available to God, to blow the day off in the name of God and be available. And I think some of these very practical things can be very helpful. Befriending your pastor, you may not be the one that gets all the nitty-gritty details, and that's okay, but at least encouraging and praying for and challenging your pastor to make sure they have a safe space to be able to talk with other people about that, whether that's you or not.
That's good, JR. Thank you so much. What else? Do you want to leave anything else with this? What, as much as we could cover in a 45-minute interview?
Yeah, I'm grateful that we get a chance to talk about this, because just like with shame, the more you talk about it, the less you feel it. And the less you talk about shame, the more you feel it. And I think I'm really grateful, and I'm hoping this can awaken not just pastors who are hurting, but also churches that are really saying, I want to care for our pastors in preventative ways. And I long for seminaries and Christian colleges, Bible colleges, and other places in a preventative way to deal with the issue now upstream rather than pull the dead bodies out of the river downstream, so as to help do this. But we really desperately need a theology of failure, because Jesus, seen as one of the great failures, at least in the first century, that bloodied cross and that ridicule is the very reason that the tomb is empty, that gives us the hope that we have. And I think if, people joke about saying, oh, Jared, when I think about failure, I immediately think of you now. And it kind of becomes this little joke, and I say, I'm okay with that as long as your second thought is about grace. Mm-hmm. You can think of me when it comes to failure, but I hope your second thought is about Jesus and about grace right after that. Because that's all this is. It's about, do we actually preach the same gospel message to ourselves that we preach to others from the pulpit? And if we can't understand grace, why in the world do we think our people are going to grasp grace? So as long as it ends up at grace, I think that's the most important thing.
We'll have links to the book and to where you are online. We'll have all that on the show notes for the show for everybody who's listening. And J.R. Briggs, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Shane. It's always a privilege to talk about this important topic.
I want to take just a second to talk about how important this book is that JR has written, Fail. If you are not a pastor yourself, then I would really encourage you to go get this book and give it to your pastor. And if you can't, then email them, Facebook them a link to this show so that they could hear it and maybe go out and buy the book themselves. I think it's so important, and I think that it would really communicate to your pastors that you care about them, that you love them, and that you want to take care of them. And if I can say anything else, it would just be, please, please, be a friend to your pastor, be a supporter. And when you see them do something good, when that sermon hit the spot or they just did the right thing in some circumstance, please, please go tell them that. Don't assume that they know that, because they don't unless you tell them. So please do that for your pastors out there. The next thing that I want to talk about is that you might have noticed that there is new Seminary Dropout artwork. I liked the old artwork. I kind of came up with it myself. I didn't actually design it on the screen, but I had the idea for it, and it served us well for a long time. But I thought it needed some updating, and I brought it to my friend, Brian Butler, who's a graphic design artist, and I was just saying, I just think it needs a little bit of updating. I kind of really want to keep up the same concept, and he completely ignored me, and it was the right thing to do because what he came up with was so much better. And so go check out that artwork if it's not in front of you on your iPhone or your computer screen. It's amazing. And he also designed a new banner for the website, for my website. So go to shaneblackshear.com and check out the new look. I'm in love with it. It looks so good, so good. So if any of you out there are looking for some graphic design work, Google Brian Butler, Bryn Butler in Austin, Texas, and he can do something fantastic for you. So a little bit of plug for him. The next thing that I want to talk about is the Patreon campaign. Some of you may know a few weeks ago, I launched a campaign to fund the show. If you don't know about Patreon, go to patreon.com, just how it sounds, and check out the concept. It's kind of like Kickstarter, but a little bit different. And we reached our first goal. Our first goal was when we reached $15 per episode. that I would then be able to afford to send a microphone in the mail to our guests. For those of you who have been listening for a long time, you know that the only complaints that I've gotten about the show are that the guests' audio is not so good. And that would make sense because they're not professional podcasters. I'm not a professional podcaster. They're not podcasters at all. And so a lot of times they're speaking through the microphone that's built into their laptop. And I couldn't do a lot about that in the past. But I set the goal, once we reach $15 an episode, we would send a microphone to the guests if they need one. And so I'm several interviews ahead. And so it'll be a while before you start hearing the interviews with people who have the good microphones. But look forward to that. So I think this is so cool because you, the listener, made that happen when you gave to the show. So if you want to support it yourself, you can go to supportseminarydropout.com, just like the guy in the intro said. And there's a few rewards in there for you if you contribute. And you can contribute as little as 25 cents per show. And that totally adds up. And I'm so thankful for all of the supporters of this show. So thank you. The show is about to get a lot better because of you. All right. That's all I've got for this week. I think I need to say thank you, Pastor Tim, for leaving a review on iTunes. Remember, please, please, please always go rate, review, subscribe to Seminary Dropout in iTunes or your podcatcher of choice. I need to thank my new supporter, Richard. Richard, thank you so much for the kind contribution to Seminary Dropout. You put us over the goal to send a microphone to the guests. So thank you for doing that, and all of my supporters for doing that. Thank you, Richard. Last but not least, as always, the music you're listening to is from D.L. Rossi. Go check him out on iTunes. All right, I love you, friends, and have a great week. Join me next time for another great episode of Seminary Dropout.
So I will read what I've sown now.